Good day, everyone! Londononion here with another Challenger Prime build fitting for the Apocalypse difficulty. And our secondary archetype for this discussion is the Invader. After my first introduction to the Invader, I always figured I would pair these two, among other archetypes, with ease. The Challenger has shown up at least once with each of our primes, especially since every archetype would fare well with some extra armor, so to speak. Given how the Challenger operates in combat, the Invader is a perfect fit as an accompanying archetype. The Invader is mainly oriented to evasion and enemy misdirection, and can function as a counterfighter with the Challenger. Their archetype trait, Untouchable, will also come in useful for the Challenger with increased evasion efficacy. This will give way to a series of potential pathways for using these two as a pair, but without further delay, I'll proceed with the pathway that I favor most thus far. Starting with the build. It seems to be a trend, but for this build I equip the Loadout Mark II armor set, and the relic I employ is primarily the enlarged heart, though the shielded heart is also a viable option. The shards I attach are armor effectiveness, charge melee cost, and skill cooldown. Moving on to the weapons, there is a lot of wiggle room for each category, but I choose to go with the Royal Hunting Bow with Time Lapse and the Supercharger Mutator. This will enhance charge speed by 30% and increase critical chance by 15%. The secondary I choose is the Nimble Service Pistol with Song of Aether and Spirit Healer as an avenue for health maintenance while slowing foes. The melee weapon I favor is Stonebreaker with the Shocker Mutator. After 3 hits, one's melee weapon becomes empowered and will inflict shock damage to a 7-meter radius following the next landed charge attack. The maximized effect applies overloaded for 5 seconds, or 1 additional electric burst. As for the accessories, the Amulet leading this build is the Difference Engine. Since the update, the Difference Engine now grants 4.5% of base damage dealt as lifesteal, and increases damage by 20% while a shield is active. Our first ring is Excess Coil, which grants a shield for 25% of one's max health for 15 seconds upon activating a skill. Tightly Wound Coil is also an option, and this nuance will be touched on during our final discussion. Next, Burden of the Rebel, which reduces relic use speed by 25%, but also reduces skill cooldown by 15%. Following, I employ the Rerouting Cable, which grants a 5% shield for 5 seconds for every 20 stamina units expended. This maximizes at 50% and resets after 5 seconds of inactivity. Lastly, I employ Burden of the Audacious, which decreases all healing by 50%. All perfect dodges, however, heal for 25% of their max health. Transitioning to the traits, I employ Fortify, Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Arcane Strike, Bark Skin, Recovery, and Siphoner. As for our skills, for the Challenger side, I employ Juggernaut, and for the Invader, either the Void Cloak or Wormhole, depending on ring choices. Juggernaut grants 3 stacks of Bulwark, increases melee prowess, and reduces stagger from enemies. Void Cloak grants perfect dodges from incoming damage for 60 seconds. Each perfect dodge will reduce one's timer by 33 to 100% depending on the damage avoided, and will spawn a decoy for 3 seconds. Wormhole warps the caster in whatever direction they are looking, and gain a 300% damage buff to their next ranged or melee attack within a 5-second window. If aimed at an enemy, they will appear behind them. Using this skill will also count as a perfect dodge. Transitioning to our discussion, the main meta behind this build is to be an elusive close quarters combatant. Despite the 2 skill options for the Invader, I favor the Wormhole skill more than the Void Cloak. If equipping Tightly Wound Coil, then I would employ Void Cloak. Tightly Wound Coil is a firearm-oriented ring, and the automatic dodges aren't conducive to a swift melee counter. Instead, they create ample space and seem fitting for a strategy that operates best with keeping their distance. Plus, it creates a decoy, so this really does help with enemy misdirection. Wormhole comes with a massive damage buff and puts the jumping into the hands of the caster as opposed to Void Cloak. Given our rings and shards, cooldown for the wormhole is a mere 19.2 seconds, allowing one to jump around frequently and take regular advantage of the damage buff window. The appeal of this skill is that the damage buff applies to both ranged and melee damage. The implication here is that the wormhole skill can also be used as a means of seamless repositioning with a heavy counter within a 5-second window. Burden of the Audacious will then play a heavy role in keeping one alive whether or not they are in combat. In addition, if employing excess coil, one will be granted a shield following their skill activation and will have a buff in damage due to the difference engine. Bulwark stacks take a bit of a back seat, but the role Juggernaut is intended to play is allow one the ability to strong arm their way through impending enemy onslaught so as to lay down their own damage. I wouldn't call this pairing particularly tanky, but it can sustain a fair amount of punishment. As a cushion to trading damage while engaged in melee combat, the rerouting cable and siphoner trait will aid with providing protection and lifesteal, respectively. The primary and secondary weapon were intended to be balancing choices to prevent the die-hard destroyer from becoming too one-dimensional. The initial idea was to use some sort of shotgun class as the primary and some sort of reliable secondary, but I found favor with having a greater level of mastery of long-range and mid-range combat with our firearms, coupled with an already bolstered capability in dealing with enemies at close range. Not all enemies can be dealt with effectively with close-range tactics. There are some enemies that prefer to keep their distance and attack from afar, i.e. airborne targets. Trying to close the distance with Wormhole and attack effectively is hampered by evasive enemy movement. So instead, one can take advantage of the mobility of Wormhole for faster positioning and take out a given enemy with a single arrow, as opposed to multiple. This also plays into my weapon choices. Ranged combat is not the strength of this pairing, but when such tactics are necessary, then our loadout can maximize effectiveness while limiting the duration. Part of helping this build function the way as intended is the mods and mutators. The Song of Aether and Time-Lapse mod are both intended to serve similar purposes. They affect a large group of enemies and freeze or slow them down. As a single target with a specialty in close quarters combat, it helps to have widespread attacks that allow one smoother use of their abilities. Since these are expensive mods, they are mainly meant to serve as either emergency responses or proactive strategies for efficiently eliminating tough targets. Plus, with the Spirit Healer Mutator on our trusty pistol, 40% of one's health can be replenished with using the respective mod. Speaking of mutators though, the Shocker Mutator on our melee weapon plays into the same strategy of inflicting damage on multiple targets at the same time. If not Shocker, either Dervish or Opportunist would serve as good alternatives that synergize directly with Wormhole. For this build though, I prefer Shocker since there is no time limit on its empowerment. Most basic enemies will not sustain a single electric burst, let alone 2. Tough enemies will naturally sustain more damage, but with only 3 hits needed and the ability to teleport regularly, overloading targets becomes a major part of the strategy with this build. One can essentially move like a butterfly and sting like an arc of lightning. One of the limitations of this pairing is that decoys take a trunk seat in combat and is limited to relic use, so enemy misdirection is sacrificed for increased elusiveness. The Die-Hard Destroyer may not be a tank, but more like a truck with surprising and effective mobility. Now, I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.